Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're spending a little bit of time here on this very important piece of narrative in the story of Avraham and Sarah. And that, of course, is the hospitality that Avraham gave the three strangers, and this whole concept of reaching out. And very often, by the way, Avraham is associated with chesed. And I love to translate chesed these days as kindness. Olam chesed yibaneh. The world is built up on kindness, and hospitality is a very, very fundamental act of kindness. So we have, of course, Torah Temimah that we're looking at, and we're going on with the various verses that are spent in describing what Abraham did for them. And the fact that he didn't just have his servants do everything, he himself got involved in the process. Ve'el habakar ratz Avraham, and to the cattle ran Abraham. Vayikach ben bakar rach batov, and he took a calf that would be rach, would be soft, v'gud, v'tov, and good, vayiten el hanar, and he gave it to the lad. I believe the lad is understood to be Yishmael. Vayimaher, and he hurried, right, lasot oto, to prepare it. He quickly got going to prepare it. So there's some words here that are in the verse that are not necessarily essential words. So, for example, the Sirach Vatov here, that describing the calf that he prepared as soft and good and delicious, right? Didn't have to be in there. Could have just said he took the calf and he gave it to his servant or to the young man, etc. So that, of course, forces a question as to why these words are in. It just makes that question clear. And let's take a look at here. Okay. Ben Bakar, right? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Sid, Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. Rav being a major player. Abba Aricha, he was head of an academy, a major player in the Babylonian Talmud. He's a Babylonian Amara. Ben Bakar, so the fact that it says Ben Bakar, Echad, so that was one. Rach, Shnaim, the fact that it says soft, that means he took two calves. Vatov, Shalosh. So the Vatov would indicate three of them going on. The Lama Le Talta, right? Bechad Sagi. He says, well, this is three gentlemen. Why did he need three? Lama Le Talta. Why did he have three of them? Bechad Sagi, it would have been enough just to take one, right? Would have been enough to divide it up, and he didn't have enough to eat if he'd just taken one calf for three people. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava, said Rav Chana, son of Rava, Kedei lachilam shalosh leshonot kechardal. It's because he really was going out of his way to give them a delicacy. It was in order to feed them 3 tons with mustard. So that delicacy, and so he needed to slaughter 3 calves in order to feed them with that. Okay? Calf's tongue. Going on, and I believe here we are, Kaf Bet. Umefaresh b'Gemara, and it's explained in the Gemara, ve'em achad. So let me say he just had one, just one. Ukida amre inshi rachich vatov, and it's so in other words, why don't we just say? You say, well, people say, when they're describing food or if they're describing the tongue and they want to describe how good it is, they simply say rach vatov, soft and delicious. Right? It would be enough. Umashni, and they teach there, imkain, if that were the case, if that was what the verse simply meant, lichtov rach tov, then it should have left out the vav. It shouldn't have said rach vatov, right? It should be soft, delicious. It should not have had that vav in. Omi dichtiv vatov, but since it says and good, shma mina the drasha, we can infer from this that it can support an interpretation, or that it needs to be interpreted. Ufarich. So then there's another objection, or another objection for Ema Trey. So why don't you just say it's two? That the Rach Vatov is describing two calves. Umashni, and there it teaches me de Tov Lidrasha, because we're saying that the Tov itself has to be interpreted, Rachnami Lidrasha. So we might as well say that the Rach also. It could have just said Tov, but because it says Rach Vatov, we're going to use each of those words to drash out a different color. Ve'od shaki v'tali had Gamar. So the Gemara in that place is not satisfied. It continues to debate the interpretation. Go on. Shaki v'tari. There's when they discuss the words that they use to discuss the debates that go on in the Gemara, where they go back and forth. Shaki v'tari. So the Gemara goes back and forth, the hochachat mispar shloshakan, in terms of challenging the number three that is mentioned here. Ukefi hanire, and it would appear, kol tircha Gemara. In other words, the question is, why is the Gemara going to so much effort to prove the point, right? So the effort tirchat Gemara, lo hochachat davar zeh, to prove this particular issue, that it's three of them, kedei lahagdil erech hakavod she'asa Abraham. It's in order to magnify the level of honor that Abraham performed la'orchav, for his guests, lahachilam, in order to feed them, to treat them to shlosh lashonot b'chardal, three tongues in with mustard, k'nimufaresh, as is stated above. However, tzarich iyun, we need to look at this further. There are other problems with this particular drush. Lefi ma shekatuv bebrachot nun aleph, because according to what's written in the tractate Brachot of the Talmud, page 55a, the chashiv sham, that there they count bein hadrarim hamaviim lidei tachtoniot. They list amongst those things that can lead to hemorrhoids. Interesting, right? Morige behema. Morige, they call morige behema. And what do we mean by morige behema? Ufiresh Rashi explains, kol basar, any meat, sheba behema, which is in the cattle, she'eno chalak, which is not smooth, ela domeh lemorag charutz, but it looks like a threshing sled, right? A sharp threshing sled. And if to just describe what a threshing sled looks like, basically it's a board with spikes underneath, and with which you go over the wheat and you chop it into fine pieces to a point where the wheat can then be winnowed. In other words, it's chopped into very, very fine pieces. And then what you do is, of course, you use a winnowing fork to throw these pieces up into the air, and the wind carries off the very light chaff, and the wheat seeds actually fall to the ground. So if you think about it, the piece of meat that has rough edges to it, we could say, is like, that's the word morag. That's where they get it as the morige behema. She'eno chalak, it's not smooth, kagon hachach, which is similar to the palate of the animal, v'halashon, and there it says, specifically, the tongue. The imkain, and if this is the fact, how is it possible Abraham, that Abraham would feed et orchav, he'd feed his guests the shonot, to give them tongue, because it gives them it will give them stomach problems, right? Stomach illness, intestinal problems. Well, not necessarily intestinal, but certainly in their digestive system. How do we deal with this? It's possible to say, Al pi man amar b'Shabbat, according to what is mentioned in Tractate Shabbat. Pei Aleph Aleph says, this would be page 81a. Daha de morige behema mevi'im lidei tachtoniot, that the fact that it says that these rough edible parts of an animal are conducive to bring one to have hemorrhoids. Ukeshehem balo melach would be only if they are unsalted. If they're salted, it's not a problem, but if they're unsalted, then they can lead to hemorrhoids. V'yesh lomar, and we could say shetavlin, that the spice hem bimkom melach, that the spice he had with it, in other words, the mustard he put with it, was in the place of salt. For imkain, and if this is the case, mikevan shemevuar kan she'echilam b'hashonot im chardal, and since it says explicitly here that he fed those tongues with mustard, shehem kamod tavlin, which would be like spices. Mustard is a spice. Shuv leikachashes toniot. So again, there's no problem. There's no suspicion that it might lead to hemorrhoids. V'gam yesh lomar, and moreover, one can say al pi ma shekatuv katav Rashi b'Shabbat Sham, according to what Rashi wrote in Tractate Shabbat there, describing this, the morigei beheme he basar ha'evarim halal, where he defines the morigei behamal as those that meat in the animal that we've mentioned. Im haklip, okay, im haklipot. That means it has the skin of these particular parts with the particular organs. In other words, that the tongue is unpeeled; it's got the peel of the tongue on it, etc. And according to the point that Rashi makes there, yesh lomar, we could say de below haklipa ein ze bichlal morigim, that if in fact it is served without the skin of it, then you don't call it a morig, right? It's no longer this rough part of the meat. So we spend quite a little bit of time trying to just narrow down and parse out this particular issue. The typical way in which the Gemara discusses things. The loves the debate going on. Vayikach, so we'll go to the next verse. Here we go. Vayikach chema v'chalav, he took butter and milk, uvin habakar asher asa, and the calf which he had prepared, vayiten lifnehem, and he put it before them, v'hu umed aleihem tachat ha'etz v'yochelu, and he stood with them underneath the tree, and they ate. Now, I know that the fact is that we're talking about mixing milk with meat, and people notice that usually very quickly. So, how does one deal with this? I do not know that Torah Temimah or the Gemara is necessarily worried about this. And there are two possibilities. One is, of course, that they first ate the bread and the butter, whatever, the milk, etc. And after they were finished, in other words, they then waited a little bit, and then they ate. Then he served them the meat. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that the laws of kashrut were given in the Torah, and so that the laws of kashrut did not apply at this particular time. Now, while that sounds like, I think, a fairly compelling answer, there are other statements within the tradition that would make that a difficult statement to take. And that is that Abraham observed the entire Torah. There's a sense in which he observed all the mitzvot, etc., even before they were given at Mount Sinai. Now, whether that statement itself is to be taken literally, or whether the Gemara is simply trying to say that Abraham lived his life as if he were observing every specific mitzvah, that the real issue had to do with how much he served God and how much he loved God and how much he represented the divine presence in this world. That could well be what that meaning is of that particular statement. But regardless, there are ways in which we can understand what's going on here, despite what appears to be a difficulty. So let's take a look at Torah Temimah here. Vayikach chema v'chalav. So he took butter and milk. Ve'ilu lechem lo hevi, So he's saying, well, he said he was that they should have a loaf of bread. It doesn't mention anything about him getting bread. Amar Ephraim Miksha'a. So Ephraim Miksha'a, Talmido shel Rabbi Meir, who was a student of Rabbi Meir, Oto Hayom, that particular day, Pirsa Sarah Nida. Sarah had her period. So obviously, and it said earlier on, Sarah was at an age where her periods had ceased, and the Torah is explicit about that. So the idea that she might have actually experienced a period at this point, of course, implied that she was fertile once again, and that's probably what's leading to this particular comment. For Avraham Avinu and Abraham, our patriarch, Haya Ochel Chulim B'Tahara. So he had a practice, there was a practice of those people who wanted to be very strict in their practice. We know that when it came to sanctified food, this is something we've learned a number of times, that one cannot eat sanctified food in a state of impurity. And of course, we know that when one becomes when has a period, that is itself a state of impurity that leads you into a state of impurity. And Abraham had the practice that even though hulin means non-sanctified food, that even though it was non-sanctified food and sacrificial associated with the practice in the temple, that despite that fact, Abraham ate the food that he had, the chulin, the non-sanctified food, the Torah, in a state of purity. So that's Ephraim Mikshah's explanation of why he didn't bring any bread. He couldn't do it because that would have violated his own practice of eating chulin, eating non-sanctified food in purity and act of purity. So let's take a look at what Torah Temimah has to say here. Lechora, on the surface, ein hechreach la kushia. This is not a must question. Some of the questions, of course, are we understand very well why we're asking those questions. But he's saying the question doesn't appear obvious. But ilu lechem lo hevi, that is to say, and didn't he bring bread? The ema, because we could say asalahem suda lechem, that the reason why he didn't give them bread, he made them a banquet without bread. Shechein be'emet min parsiim. He says, in fact, that is the custom of Persians to eat their food, a major meal, without bread. Kamosha Katov Eruvin, we see that this is mentioned in Tractate Eruvin, Kaf Tet, on page 29. Now, I don't know what this means here. Does it mean on the B side of the page? Eruvin does have a tractate in the Talmud, so that the pages would have an A and B side, and I'm not sure if this is a misprint or what, and we'd have to double check. I'll have to look at other versions if I can of Torah Temimah and see if it's there as well, and then maybe I need to look it up and see what this means. But normally it would be 29 A or B. Ach b'chol zeh. Oh, you know what it could be? I'm going to guess what this means. Sof Amud Bet. In other words, it's page 29 as you get to the end of the B side of the page. And that would make sense here. So he's giving us a clearer reference as to where to find this. Ach b'chol, but nevertheless, mukhrachat hakushia, right? But in fact, the question itself, he says, is an important question. It's a legitimate difficulty, because before that, he says, prepare flour, the imkain lama lo heviam. And if that's the case, why didn't he bring them? If he told Sarah to take flour, etc., why didn't he bring that when it's mentioned as to what he fed them? So he is saying in the end that in fact it is a legitimate question. Okay. Going on. Let's try one more. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. Hu omed alehem, and he stood over them. Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua. There's a story told about Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Tzadok, and Rabbi Tzadok. Shayu Mesubim Bebeit Mishteh Bno Shel Rabban Gamliel. They were gathered together eating at a banquet of the son of Rabban Gamliel. V'haya Rabban Gamliel omed umashke alehem. And it was in Rabban Gamliel's home, and Rabban Gamliel was serving. He was the wine steward, etc. But basically, he was their waiter. Amar le Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, Le Rabbi Yoshua, to Rabbi Yoshua, Maze Yoshua, what's going on, Rabbi Yoshua, Joshua? Anu Yoshvim, we're sitting, the Gamliel, Barabi Omed Umashkelanu, and Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, stands and gives us, libation, he serves us, etc. Amar, so he said to him, Matzinu gedul mimenu shishimesh. We know someone even greater than Rabban Gamliel who served in this particular capacity. Avraham gadol hadorhaya. Abraham was the greatest man in his generation. And yet it says regarding him, Vahu omed alehem, that he stood over them. B'shema tomar k'malachei hashareh nidmulo. Would you say that, well, the reason that he was doing that is because he realized that they were ministering angels. We know ultimately that they were angels, and they certainly were important, like Gabriel, Raphael, and Michael. Okay, so really, was the reason that Abraham was standing and serving them was because he recognized the fact that they were angels? Lo nidmulo ela arviim. That's not true. They only appeared to him as Arabs. Va'anu lo yehe Rabban Gamliel barabi omedu mashkelenu. So if that's the case, that in the case of Abraham, who was certainly greater than Rabban Gamliel, was standing and serving the three men, and he assumed that they were Arabs, and yet he offered them such amazing hospitality. Doesn't it imply that for Rabban Gamliel to stand and serve us, that's perfectly fine too? And we'll leave that there for today. Stop the share. Okay. So, any comments, any thoughts before we close the recording? Yes. Harlan? Yeah, go ahead.
Could another reason for the meat and milk be the fact that the earliest was the simplest, that it wasn't, like they knew that it wasn't the mother's milk,
Oh,
so
I
it was
see.
okay?
Yeah, I mean, but the truth is, if it was, remember he prepared calves for them, so they certainly would have had a cow that would have given them milk, and we don't know that, that's the case here, that would have been the reason. I'm pretty sure, I hear where you're coming from, and it is interesting because the law is, the law is that one should not seethe the kid in its mother's milk. And that's a very good point, actually, Lauren. And I think I'm going to try and remember it as well, because essentially, you could say that biblically, you're not allowed to boil a kid in its mother's milk, and that's the biblical commandment. And the fact that we separate milk from meat the way we do is rabbinic. So there's still a question as to whether or not Abraham also followed, because they're making this major statement that Abraham, who lived so long before the Torah was actually given, was observing every element. I mean, I think they even say that Abraham observed the laws of Eruvin, which are pretty rabbinic all the way up and down. So, I think it's a good argument. Is it an argument that cannot be assailed? Unfortunately not, but I still think it's a good argument, and that the reason why he would have served milk and meat is because he wasn't seething the calf tongue in the milk, and that's the way it's stated in the Torah itself. So
Yeah.
no, so it's a really good point. It never occurred to me. Harlan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was wondering about. I see some Jews eating a hamburger and cheese together.
Okay,
I know it's
Harlan,
delicious, but
Harlan. So I have to say to you that if the meat isn't kosher to begin with, right? Since they shouldn't be eating treif meat, okay, meat that isn't kosher, the issue of whether it's with cheese or not actually is irrelevant. It, that's not the violation already started the moment they put non-kosher meat on their hamburger. And
yeah,
the addition of adding cheese to it, I think at that point doesn't even count. So
yeah,
yeah. Now, if it
but
was kosher, it was a kosher hamburger and they're putting cheese on it. Now you've got problems. So,
yeah,
it's right.
uh,
The famous question, what's the bracha for a bacon cheeseburger?
yeah.
May God keep the bacon cheeseburger, bless and keep the bacon cheeseburger far away from us.
That's right. That's a good answer. Okay, on that, I'd like to end the session. So thank you.